This is the fifth and final part of the stories I found about the Jackson family's ancestors. My name is Andre, and I'm a genealogist who helps people to discover their history. We last left off in 1920, where Nero was a 75-year-old man who had purchased 280 acres of land years prior, but had been taken advantage of by the Texas Oil Company in 1920. According to his son William, by 1930, Nero was 85 years old and had to stop working the land. After a lifetime of agricultural labor, a skill he was forced to learn during his time as a slave, Nero's body began to physically fail him, and he was physically unable to tend to the land. He had his wife Emmeline as well as two younger family members who were able to be helpful on the farm, but Emmeline was in her late 70s by this time, and there was over 200 acres of land to tend to. There was only so much that they were able to do. Enter Carl Raymond Ewald. Ewald was a very powerful and wealthy white man in southern Mississippi. He was the grandson of a German immigrant who came to the United States with his brother to Virginia, who began a family enterprise. This family enterprise positioned Ewald's grandfather to become very important and wealthy within the community they lived in Virginia. Carl's father, John, was a Confederate soldier fighting for the South's insistence on anti-blackness. Carl's father inherited his father's business, his land, and wealth, and owned two slaves, all before Carl was born. Carl grew up in a very wealthy household during Reconstruction that had black and white servants. He took his share of his father's estate and went to Louisiana, where he married the daughter of a wealthy timber company owner, took his wealth and family and established themselves in Centreville, Mississippi, which is in between Amite and Wilkinson counties in southern Mississippi. There, he helped establish the Farmers Exchange Bank and was the vice president. He also later became an alderman in Centreville, Mississippi. And with his wealth, he opened up the Ewald Mercantile Company. It positioned him to become the sole mercantile of the community. He supplied groceries, dry goods, clothing and hardware, and other necessities that residents and the farmers needed to survive. This was a very powerful person in the community. He had owned land of his own, trying his hand at cotton, but was put out of the industry due to boll weevils. In 1919, he switched over to peppers and had in 1929 over 2,000 acres of peppers in Wilkinson County, Mississippi. And he's recorded as saying that farmers who grew peppers had gotten out of debt by just utilizing 1 to 2 acres. He is recorded conveying his ambitions to convert more land in Mississippi where cotton was growing to peppers so that they can continually make profits off of this crop. This is the man that Nero and other farmers in the community had to depend upon for their survival. Because of his position within the community, he would have found out about Nero's situation and how he was unable to really tend to his farm. And sure enough, by 1931, he caught wind that Nero couldn't pay his property taxes. In 1931, Nero was forced to sell a vast majority of his land to Ewald just to be able to cover the debt he owed for his property taxes, all because he wasn't able to generate enough income to do this. This sale was in alignment with Ewald's ambitions. Prior to this, he had an established history of acquiring hundreds of acres of land owned by families, black and white. So to Ewald, here was this elderly old black man who was sitting on hundreds of acres of land that he was desirous of. Unfortunately, this was the perfect setup for Nero to have the land that he had worked so hard to attain, to care for, to tend to, with his blood, sweat, and tears, with everything that he put into it, and have it all be taken away from him. Remember, according to Ewald, he said that just 1 to 2 acres of land was necessary for a farmer to get out of financial ruin. This was what could have helped Nero, but that's not how he assisted Nero. Sadly, on July 23rd, 1932, Nero's wife Emmeline passed away. She was 78 years old and still trying to labor on the land that they owned, right up into the end of her life. Dependency upon Ewald grew. In March 1933, Ewald was able to acquire the land of Nero's former partners, his neighbors who lived around him. Ewald was now surrounding Nero and the little bit of land he had left. Joe Jackson wrote that Nero became feeble in his old age and had come down to the last of all of his money. He wrote that Nero had depended upon Ewald in his store and eventually became in debt to him, no longer being able to pay for what he needed for his survival. Sadly, in April 1933, Ewald was finally able to get all of the rest of Nero's land. Joe Jackson gives us a little bit more detail about how this occurred. He says that Nero's state caused him to, quote, hand over to Ewald for storage some important papers so he could keep for him. In the end, Ewald managed to appropriate documents on owning the farm, ostensibly as debt payments, which Nero owed him. The paper trail and the family's oral history line up, saying that Ewald got way more out of his dealings with Nero because it wasn't tied to his survival, it was tied to his greed. Sadly, Nero died in his home on October 12, 1934, of senile debility, or physical and mental decline. This man, Nero Jackson, had lived 90 years in this anti-Black world. So these are the stories I found of the famous Jackson family. July and Jenny had Nero. Nero and Emmeline had Samuel Jackson. Samuel and Crystal Lee King had Joseph Walter Jackson. And Joe Jackson and Catherine Scrouse became parents to the talented, world-famous entertainers, the Jacksons.